and welcome to the book launch of Thera Mjaaland's recent publication, Revolutionary Struggles and Girls' Education at the Frontiers of Gender Norms in North-Ethiopia. The Global Research Program on Inequality is honored to be organizing this event together with the author of the book, Thera Mjaaland, and with Bergen Global. We have a really excellent panel for today's book launch, so let me briefly introduce them. And I would like to start with the author of the book, Thera Mjaaland, who is an art photographer and social anthropologist. She's an independent researcher and filmmaker affiliated with FAFU Norway, Department of Social Anthropology, Addis Ababa University, and Institute for Environment, Gender and Development, Mekelle University, Ethiopia. We also have the honor of welcoming today Professor Eileen Unterhalter, who is a professor of education and international development at the University College London. She works on themes concerned with gender, race, and class inequalities and their bearing on education. She will be joining us digitally today. Another panelist who is joining also digitally today is Mulu Beyene Kidanemariam, who is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law at the University of Bergen, and who is a member of a research group in welfare law and has published widely on issues concerning law in Ethiopia. Another panelist who we are glad to welcome here today is Vibeke Vågenes, who is an associate professor at the Department of Pedagogy, Religion and Social Studies at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Her main research area is Tanzania, and her work focuses on gender and education, sustainable development, and implementation of new knowledge in education. And finally, but not least, I would like to introduce a person who will lead and guide us through today's event, and that is Professor Haldis Håkanes, who is a social anthropologist and professor in the Department of Health Promotion and Development at the University of Bergen. Welcome, everybody. Haldis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elina. I would just like to say a few words about the order of events here today. What will happen now is that I will give the floor to the author herself, Thera, and then so she will speak for about 10 minutes, giving a presentation of her book. And following from that, we will have the three panelists commenting on the book in the following order: Elaine, Vibeke, and Mulu at the end. And each of the panelists will have around 5 to 7 minutes. And then we move on to a more general discussion, first among the panelists and Thera, and then I will open the floor to discussion and questions also from the audience. So welcome to this event also from me, and Thera, the floor is yours.
Welcome. I'm very happy that you are willing to share this event with me. This monograph is summing up my experience and anthropological research from Askeret Embla Warada in northwestern Tigray, North Ethiopia, between 1993 and 2019. It encompasses my master's, PhD, postdoc research, and includes as well knowledge gained through my photographic practice and film work. Over this period of time, an impressive expansion of the school system on all levels in Ethiopia has happened before my eyes. Schools have popped up even in remote rural areas. So has health clinics and infrastructure in terms of roads, electricity, telecommunication, and clean water. Gender equality has also been incorporated into laws and policies which presuppose a mainstreaming of gender issues on all administrative levels in the country. These 26 years coincide with the EPRDF coalition government in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, where TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, had a dominating role from 1991 until 2018, when Abiy Ahmed from Oromo Democratic Party within the EPRDF coalition took over as prime minister. TP left the coalition in November 2019 when Abiy restructured it as his prosperity party, disagreeing on the level of autonomy of the regions versus a centralized government rule. The civil war that started in November 2020 and where the Tigrayan people have been collectively punished with extrajudicial killings and summary imprisonments based on ethnicity, systematic rape, and mass starvation for whatever else the TPLF has done during their time in power is therefore outside the scope of my study. The book has, however, and unintendedly so, become a historical document over the impressive developments in Tigray, which now is lost in the ongoing war. The main question that the book turns on is, why are Tigrayan girls generally performing poorer than boys from secondary school onwards, when they at this stage are outnumbering boys? A tendency which also can be seen in the rest of Ethiopia, albeit to differing degrees. My focus links up with a concern among researchers, among them Elaine Unterhalter and some global actors like UNESCO's Education for All initiative, that gender inequalities persist despite rising numbers of girls being enrolled in school. To answer this question, my tracing of what hinders equitable change spans revolutionary struggles in Ethiopia, as well as global and national development trends. On the local level, the book deals with the historical context where Tigrayan women during the 1970s and 80s participated in the revolutionary liberation struggle in Tigray for social, political, and economic reform, also for women. I include the position education got as a revolutionary strategy to enable this change for both men and women, girls and boys. In the book, I also discussed the neoliberal turn in development, which has co-opted liberal feminism, and that is primarily concerned with equality as equal numbers between girls and boys, women and men in an instrumental sense. It avoids an addressing of the gendered power and domination structures that thus may continue to operate also after parity has been reached. Herein lies what Pierre Bourdieu terms symbolic violence, which points to power and domination not being questioned because the power dynamics underlying the status quo are taken for granted. I also critique global development discourses which sees girls' education as a magic bullet in development, an assumption which has trickled down to the national level in Ethiopia. For example, in the National Action Plan for Gender Equality, it states, it has also been realized that the attainment of equal rights between the two sexes and improved women's status benefits men as well. For instance, educating girls translate into better conditions for the whole household in terms of better health, nutrition, and education for the family. An educated woman is more likely to delay marriage, practice family planning, resulting in a smaller family size, more available food for the family, and resources to educate the children. Investing in girls' education therefore has high social and economic returns and is instrumental in achieving sustainable development and economic growth. Sylvia Shand calls this neoliberal trend where gender equality is instrumentalized and seen as smart economics and leading to a feminization of responsibility and/or obligation. Furthermore, nowhere in the above and similar statements which traverse the global development field is it mentioned that for the expected fertility decline to kick in, girls must have learned at secondary school level. So what are the social cultural norms that set in at this level that make Tigrayan girls on average perform poorer than boys and which has repercussions for their transgression to higher education? In fact, acquiring respect and honor, kabri, is important for the girls too. It depends on how well she meets social expectations as encompassed in Serene Kader's self-subordination, social recognition, paradox. The book excavates the religious-informed social-cultural gender norms in this predominantly Orthodox Christian context by drawing on Bourdieu's habitus concept, where, in his words, what is essential goes without saying because it comes without saying. The tradition or norm is silent, not least about itself as tradition. Through an ideal femaleness, which is based on Virgin Mary's virtuousness, the Tigran girls in my study learned to hold back, and embodied learning, making her shy and embarrassed if asked to speak up. It follows her in and through education and affects her self-efficacy, especially after puberty sets in and control of her sexuality intensifies. The case is also that since the courageous female fighters during the revolutionary struggle in Tigray often were classified as men, girls cannot easily utilize these women as role models without risking their femaleness. In the book, I also point to a lack of focus on boys and men that enables the perpetuation of inequality and gender discrimination, and which throws the responsibility for change on girls and women themselves. At issue is, again, the symbolic violence at play when gender equality is conflated with parity and understood as already reached, in line with a neoliberally informed post-feminist perspective, which makes the addressing of persistent gender discrimination redundant. Or when girls' failure to perform is seen as natural as a result of their biological sex. Symbolic violence is also at issue when girls accept this interpretation. In the book, I look at why education fails its transformative potential also in a gendered sense. Despite the mention of active and learner-centered teaching methods in educational programs in Ethiopia, teaching continues to be based on memorization. From secondary school, teaching learning also takes place in English, a language the students hardly master. Together with large classes of up to 60 students, sometimes more, it makes it difficult to practice critical thinking in order to scrutinize gendered injustices. In the book, I therefore argue that it's important to trace the extent to which education actually transforms hard-lived gender norms and persistent inequality that affect girls' self-efficacy and impedes her educational performance and attainment relative to boys. The necessary conditions for a transformative education must therefore, and here I'm in line with authors like Ulla Ariak Savade and Elaine Unterhalter, to include quality education with improved teaching methods and the learning of critical thinking. It must encompass gender equality as going further than parity in order to address gendered inequality and the issue of justice. And 3, an increased focus on the intensified gendering of sexuality at puberty, and hence a focus on young people's, both female and male, sexual and reproductive health and access to information and services. This book also gives a glimpse into a hierarchical social and political structure where authority should not be questioned and which continues to be reproduced in the educational system. As one factor, it helps explain why the history keeps repeating itself so painfully in Ethiopia, since it's only who holds authority in the power structure that shifts, not the structure itself.
Thank you, Thera, for this very brief but also very sharp overview over your book. I will now give the floor to Elaine Unterhalter. Are you there? For her to give some inputs and comments to your book. And Thera, I will not allow you to give any response until all the 3 panelists have spoken, and then we will leave the floor again to Thera.
Thanks very much. And thank you for inviting me, and a huge congratulations to Thera for a really important piece of scholarship. It's a piece of work that's important on 3 levels, which I wanted to talk through and highlight to those who are listening, and also as part of, taking off my hat to Thera for doing something really, really significant. The 3 things I want to bring out is, firstly, the significance of writing a monograph, not only a monograph that reports on in-depth scholarship and engagement extremely thoughtfully with data, but that also draws on a long period of fieldwork. I've over the last few months been doing a number of large literature reviews for different organizations. And I realized that one of the things that's happened to our scholarly work in this field is a shrinking both theoretically, conceptually, and methodologically, so that the short journal article has become the major genre in which ideas are conveyed. And the short journal article misses out this depth of insight and scholarship that Thera has accumulated over years of scholarship, drawing on a disciplinary depth, questioning, self-questioning, observation. And honestly, without work of this quality, we can't move our field forward and feel respectable in the field. We're getting the highlights and thinking that the highlights constitute the whole scene, and they're only pinpricks. So the first thing I want to really deeply congratulate Thera for is the monograph and the depth of scholarship and the seriousness of the project. So the second point I want to make is to say that this is a really significant contribution to the way in which neoliberalism has co-opted ideas about gender equality in education. We're aware of it, and in the UK, I have, constantly disoriented by the kind of spectacle of our prime minister, a prime minister who performs a kind of interest in girls' education. I quote him as saying, girls' education is the Swiss Army knife for all development projects. I mean, the insensitivity, the Swiss Army knife is associated with an army in which women cannot participate. It's associated with a country where women didn't have the vote until the 1970s. The kind of grossness of the kind of rhetorical flourish underlies the way in which neoliberalism thinks that they can toss aside these, neoliberalism as an ideology, thinks that it's just, you can make a joke about bringing girls into school and trying to undo this vast gender inequality that Thera has sketched. So by making this very significant and detailed academic scholarly pushback to those ideas, I think it confronts the bombast of those rhetorical questions with the seriousness of scholarly observation and bringing out the detail and complexity of the relationships. And the third point I wanted to draw out about the significance of the book is that the way in which it doesn't just stop at critique, it does allow us, through reflecting on what has been observed, to have another way, another vision of what kind of education could be more gender equitable, could try to unseat some of the gender norms, and could be a very deep engagement with the kind of intersectional inequalities that are sketched, that have historical roots, ethnic roots, locational roots and are deeply implicated in the political economy of Ethiopia today. So there are actually very few books in our field that do this kind of work. And that's a huge congratulations to Thera for giving us this kind of scholarly contribution, the depth of the insight. And I think the implications for work on policy and practice are considerable. So I don't know if I've had my 5 minutes or if I could just make two more. Can I just make two more comments? Okay. Those are all the things I think are wonderful about the book. I think there are two more things that we probably need to think about. The one is the utilization of a theoretical framework. And Thera makes wonderful use of Bourdieu's ideas, and the way in which she works with Bourdieu's idea about distinction and works with the notion of gender distinction is very original and very rich, as is her engagement with ideas of agency, habitus and agency. But I think there's more scholarly work to be done in taking ideas that were developed to describe education in a highly stratified European society like France and bringing them to Ethiopia. And I would have liked to see much more nuance and discussion and engagement with African feminist ideas and some of the critical dialogue around that. So that's one set of questions, I guess, that I would like to explore. And the second relates to how one might think about intersectionality. So what work does intersectionality do in relation to Bourdieu's theoretical conceptualization? So I think this book is going to be hugely generative, both of a policy dialogue, of a scholarly dialogue around the methodology. I mean, there's some very interesting things about the insider-outsider that maybe we can go into in the discussion. But also it's kind of raising the flag for scholarship. And yeah, really wonderful to have the chance to read it, to hear you talk about it, and to hear you stand up for scholarly work as against the kind of shallowness of a particular genre of work that denies history, denies complexity, and denies the criticality that you're so affirming. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for your excellent inputs. I now noted down a few of them, which we will bring up with Thera afterwards. But I would now like to give the floor to Bergen. Will you be standing or sitting?
I think I'll stand up. I might. Is that okay? All right. I've written it down to make sure that I don't forget. As Elaine, I would like to start to say congratulations and say that I really enjoyed. It was a pleasure to read every page. So that's my start. Also, I would like to give a few words, or say some few words about my position from where I read this book, because it has bearing on how I comment. What wasn't said earlier was that previously I was engaged for many years for my master and PhD in Sudan, in East Sudan, in the Red Sea Hills. And then there's a certain geographic and cultural proximity in that. My PhD was a study of the gender system of Bija people there in the Red Sea. And when reading this book, there was a lot of resonance back to my experience from there. Especially, I think, this expression of holding back that I immediately related to. It makes sense to me, and I think also a lot of other people around in Africa, perhaps. Now I'm working in teacher education at HVL. As it was said, my research and much of my teaching concerns Tanzania and education. And there in Tanzania, you see a lot of similarities in the situation when it comes to education, as you show us in Ethiopia. That girls start to outnumber boys in school, actually, but yet girls seem to disappear as as the years pass in secondary education. I just checked before I came. The boys do better at exams. The difference has diminished a little bit, but still boys do better at exams in primary school and school leaving exams also in secondary school. So that situation is resembling as well the Tigrayan example, which makes it really relevant and important, I think. Then some comments to the book. As it was said by Elaine, this is an important study. Well, I mean, really appreciate it, that you come up with this. We need research that is critical too and goes beyond the general discourse on education, seeing education as the magical bullet, the thing that will benefit both the individual and the society. And for example, you have the education for all discourse that focus on enrollment in school and not on the quality or in the content of the school. As it was said here, education is seen as a key to economic growth and to development, not the least by the former Prime Minister of Norway, who was the global ambassador in this case. Then you have enrollment in school that is seen also a key to gender equality, which, as we have here now, a fundamental critique towards this understanding, confusing gender parity with gender equality, I think, which is important points that you raise. I also really appreciate that you raised the issue of the ideological perspectives behind education. What does it mean to education that neoliberalism is now dominant in education and policies around, also in Ethiopia? I guess we will also return to this later on, so I leave it now. For me, it was also very interesting to read about this, what I think about as the bodily hexes, in fact, relating to femaleness and maleness in this very rich material. The body is important when we try to understand gender, and as I read about Tigray and also in Sudan, the girls, when they enter puberty, there is a lot of change taking place. The girls start to be regarded as sexual beings, as hot. Their virginity and honor is at stake, and they must, as you say, it must be contained, controlled, and held back. This is the time when traditionally the girls retreated home and kind of closed up their body in a way. So this is my experience, and also I see parts of the same in Tanzania. And we see that sexuality and beauty of girls is peaking in the teenage years. So this period is so important, this time when they're going to school. Okay, so I also just to mention that the puberty is also the age when the menstruation sets in, and the girls are also to manage the periods that is difficult when you consider the context. And we see that girls stay home for days every month to avoid problems of bleeding through and so on. So this is a serious thing that we need to address in research. So all this adds to the increased pressure on girls. I think the pressure to stay on the right side of the frontier, so to speak, the frontier of femaleness, and not to degrade your honor and your reputation. And here you draw on the Virgin Mary for this analysis. I think this the subject of girls' sexuality, honor, and so on. It really is something that needs more research, I would like to say. For me also, I'd like to mention the pleasure that you actually used the expression of girls in and through education. For me, that was a wonderful phrasing. For me, it's also a reminder that gender norms and values of society, in fact, works through the school, and that the school is one of the central society institutions. So in other words, what takes place in school reflects and is structured by the society at large, and perhaps to a lesser degree seem to work the other way around, to change society. Or as you say at the very end of your monograph, how education fails its transformative potential. So here you rely on Bourdieu to understand how bodies are inscribed with these structural structures. There are also many other reasons for the inability of the school to address these discriminating structures. So you have Bourdieu and how order or things appear as self-evident. There's also other perspectives on this. For example, in Tanzania, everything that happens in a school is directed and controlled by the authorities. The teachers are pressed on time, but they have extremely little freedom to influence their own teaching practice. And critical thinking is non-existing, I would say, unfortunately. So this is addressed in Thera's book in the latter parts. And here an explicit line is drawn between the dominant pedagogy or the culture of teaching and learning and how this connects to gender difference. This is really interesting, I think, interesting work. And this is also a subject that we need more research on, I would say. The hierarchical top-down structure and authority relations reflect on how the students learn. In Tigray, as in Tanzania, it seems that rote learning and the banking method is dominant. And to this, you add the problem of teaching in English that neither teachers nor students actually are really well in. So one effect of all this is that the critical reflection is not self-evident. It's not evident that young people may in fact break with inherited practices, or for example, that girls can well be both ambitious and outspoken. It's neither natural to discuss, for example, unconventional behavior, early marriage, or sexual relations in the school. So I find this analysis that Thera gives us in her book a really important contribution to starting that kind of analysis that I would definitely like to see more of. So to cut it short, I think the relevance of the book goes far beyond Ethiopia and Tigray. It's a wonderful and deep analysis of course, a fantastic material that is collected over years, it's important that we have that kind of examples. It's important because you need to understand the complexity in the subordination of girls, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Vibeke, for your comparative reading of Thera's book. Thank you very much for that. I think we get to know Thera's book little by little here, also through the comments given by the panelists. And now I'm giving the virtual floor to Mulu, please, as our next and last panelist.
Thank you, Haldis. Yes, I'm sorry I cannot join you in person. And I need to start by congratulating Thera for the wonderful, very rich contribution. I enjoyed reading it from beginning to end. I was born and grew up in Adwa, 50 kilometers away from the place where Thera conducted her research. And my little reflections would therefore be personal experiences growing up in the same kind of context. And I began my schooling in 1992, where the research began, and have seen all of much of the changes in the curriculum, have experienced it, have heard, have related to people that went through much of the stories that we read in the book. That was very relatable. I want to mention three instances that were evoked when reading this. One would be the experience of my mom, who was born in a village of 14 children with rich farmer father, but was not allowed to go to school. But for some reason, she was determined, and she needed to leave the home, because the other option was to get married early when she was aged 10 rather. So she needed to go to the town and work as a maid to begin schooling, actually. She managed to get to grade 9, and she became pregnant to me, and therefore needed to drop from school, even if she was really doing good, according to the certificates I was looking. And then I replaced I was given the opportunity and managed to finish. And then after graduating, I helped her. She stopped working. So that intergenerational dependence kind of reading was very relatable, very personal. When I was in elementary school in Adwa, the first woman that I saw driving a car was a fighter, Nazanet Asfau, actually, who joined the TPLF army from Germany, where she was working as a journalist. And the kind of discussion we had when we saw a woman driving a very big, powerful Land Cruiser for the first time was a revelation, basically. This was possible. This was new in a way. And therefore, bringing in this deviation that comes in a form of the women fighters in the TPLF, in the Tigray revolution, was very apt, very relatable as well, very relevant. I think last would be the discussion Thera mentioned, where majority of the fighters that were demobilized rather in 1991, when the army was transferred to become a national one, were female, a fact I didn't know. I just knew last year when the ongoing war in Tigray began. It began in Dansha, actually, because Dansha is closer to the Amhara region, where these demobilized fighters were living, actually. Therefore, they became the most affected members of the Tigrayan society in this war. So the kind of paradox was very close to me when reading the book. Well, I think much of the intellectual side has been mentioned by the two panelists. I was amazed how you managed to knit so much of themes seemingly dispersed from socio-cultural norms to economic factors at household level, at international system, to pedagogy, to explain why gender norms are affecting girls' education in Tigray. It was one thing that has not been mentioned that I would like to mention would be the fact that it's very readable, especially in you using lots of Tigrinya expressions. A lot of them actually was for a Tigrinya reader, for instance. It's very helpful in a way. I found some of the expressions, the Tigrinya expressions, more expressive, gives you the nuances than the English translations. So that was very good. So I would say, and some things came as a surprise. For instance, I didn't really know the prominence of Virgin Mary in setting gender norms in Tigray. I know how important it is, but didn't know the scale. The pervasiveness of divorce and early marriage, that came as a surprise too. And the fact that the hierarchical TPLF was functioning in a hierarchical society, benefited or was a factor in its successful insurgence was quite new, but very persuasive as well. I just want to mention those. And again, thank you for this brilliant work. And I really look forward to rereading it and to learn a lot more from it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mulur. Thank you for your inputs and your appreciations of the book. I was wondering now if Thera, if you would like to make some comments or different points were brought up. For example, your use of Bourdieu, perhaps at the expense of, or maybe not expensive, but at least seen in relation to your use of African feminists. That was one theme, which maybe would be great if you could comment a bit on. Also, the concept of intersectionality, where could it contribute to your work or expand your work, or that was another theme. And then also teachers' freedom and the ways that teachers are regulated. So these were some of the topics that I noted as interesting in, you know, what was brought up here. Would you say a few words? And then I think we will move on to, you know, questions from the audience. And yeah.
Well, I must say I'm overwhelmed by the response and of the reading of the book. Yeah, I'm very happy that it's kind of comes through in the way you are reading it, because then I feel I actually managed to say what I want to say. When I've had a very long relationship with Bourdieu. He is really he's really difficult to read. But the reason why I have insisted on using it in this African context is because it fits so well to the things I find on the ground. I mean, it's like I've kind of tried to not to push his theory on the emperor, but the emperor has just asked for his theory in a way. So for me, this is, I mean, it is a discussion if you should use, or the usefulness of using Western theory in other contexts. But I think it's the empirical material that should guide that answer, not as a kind of ideological answer, you shouldn't use it, or you should use it, but that it's the empirical data that actually asks for a specific use of a theory. So that's also why I felt that the feminists, some of the feminist critiques from Africa that has been critiquing also Western gender theory because it doesn't fit. Those critiques doesn't necessarily fit in the Ethiopian context. Because the binary, the distinction between the genders are so pronounced. And some of these post-colonial and post-structuralist theories are kind of trying to break down that distinction, that binary divide. But it doesn't make sense to bring a theory that breaks down the theory, that divide, if divide actually exists so pronounced at the ground. So that's why I have kind of stuck to my reading, and also that because newer theory is also on this performativity of gender, and that you should kind of be whatever gender you want, and and have a freedom to kind of play out the whole register of gender identity in a context. But this is not actually what these girls can do in that context. I mean, if you go too far outside the box in relation to what is defined as the ideal femaleness, then you kind of are either defined as too male or too immoral. So it's kind of pushes the girls into that box again. So the performativity perspective also doesn't necessarily fit in this context, I think. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not performing their gender, and that is choices behind how they present themselves, but they have to kind of know the limits and what they actually risk if they go too far in one direction or another. Yeah, so now I've forgotten the other questions, but
there were different questions, but there was one about the role of the teacher and the authority of the teacher in relation to, the system that the teacher is part of.
Yeah, because when I talk about the hierarchical structure, social and political structure in Ethiopia, the teacher is also kind of part of that hierarchy, and in the classroom has a certain authority that you shouldn't necessarily question. I mean, to ask a question is in class is also, if it's too bold, might also actually challenge the teacher's authority. So it's not just kind of an open space where you can ask any kind of questions. Also the learning situation is kind of also informed by this hierarchy, where also most of the students are actually quite passive, but a bit more boys than girls are active, but a very passive situation. It's like they just deliver their lesson right on the blackboard, say any questions, and then nobody say anything, and then they leave the room. So it's kind of just yeah. I think also teachers, because in the plans, educational programs, it's said that you should strive to have more student-centered learning and active learning, these kind of things. But teachers are also not motivated to actually change that basic script, because it's easier. I mean, it will require more of them if they are going to change that teaching script and have more activity in the classes. And they also feel that they are too little paid, so they are not motivated to do anything about it. So it's kind of, it's there in the policies, but on the ground, it doesn't necessarily change anything.
Thank you. Thank you, Thera, for your answers. I think that we will now have some questions from the audience. I can see that there is, for example, at least I can see one question in the chat, but maybe there is someone else who here from the physical audience that would like to say something. Do I see any hands? I don't see any hands, but I can read a question from the chat, which says, I think that education is transformative in the long term. Could you briefly say how better education, that is better quality education, critical thinking, etc., improves the power dynamics in the society in the short and medium term?
I'm not sure I quite grasp the question. Is it the question about if critical thinking is essential at all, or is it?
I think we can imagine a hypothetical situation. So if, education, kind of invited to more critical thinking, could we then envision, in the long run, that there would be transformations? That's how I read the questions. The person who wrote it maybe you want to add
Yeah, no,
something
but
in the chat.
then I understand it. Yeah, yeah.
So what would be the consequences in the short? Would there be, for example, a revolution in the class? Or what would happen?
Well, I think it's a long process. I mean, to actually, because it's on all levels. I mean, it's the hierarchical system and the authority and the lack of a questioning attitude. It starts from childhood, actually. So, but I think as a starting point, I mean, education has a possibility to be the driver of this kind of change, because they will be the next generation that will occupy the system or be in positions. And but critical thinking alone is not enough. I mentioned three things also, that gender equality, that is actually a deep understanding of justice between the genders, and also the issue of sexuality in relation to girls. But I think critical thinking, I do believe that it is a good starting point. It wouldn't necessarily solve the whole thing, but it might make people not just start to think differently, but also start to act differently. And then it's that acting which kind of also will bring it into the society. I mean, if we just think critically, it's kind of okay, but we also have to act according to that thinking, and be bold and brave and do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So changing power dynamics is challenging. I can read from the chat,
Yeah.
which was the following up from our listener.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there is a question concerning recommendations for future research. What would be your recommendations for future research? I guess not only in Tigray, but in similar contexts when it comes to exploring gender in education.
It would be nice if more studies could kind of go deeper. I mean, into the dynamics in specific contexts. I mean, the global discourses is kind of thinking a bit like things are the same more or less, and use the same discourses for every context. So I think it's important to actually understand the different dynamics or how it plays out in specific context. I mean, as Vibeke said, she could recognize the holding back in her research from Sudan and maybe also from Tanzania. So it's not like holding back is kind of a Tigrian phenomenon. I mean, I was not speaking a lot in class either. I mean, when I was in secondary school or in high school. So it's to understand the different ways that this holding back is actually embodied in a specific context, which is interesting for me. I think there are a lot from the Tigrian context that is kind of recognizable also in other contexts, but I've tried to see how the dynamics play out in that particular place. And I think, as also I think Eileen Unterhalter also mentioned, that we need kind of more of these kinds of studies, and also that those who who control the global discourses actually pick them up and start to think about education and the dynamics in education, maybe from another perspective.
Vibeke, would you like to?
I'd just like to add to what you're saying, because, and what could be interesting further research. There are so many things, but I think your research question is a good one that should be taken up by other people as well in other contexts as well. Why is it that girls perform less well in school than boys? Because if you look at Norway, the situation is totally opposite, and it's becoming a problem here, as you know. So we are addressing it here. So what can we do for the boys? So this, for me at least, it kind of stirs a lot of interesting questions for why is the situation different there in Tigray or in Tanzania, in my case, and I'm surely other places as well. And starting there, I think you kind of display a lot of interesting research issues, I would say.
Yes, and it's interesting that in the, at least in the Norwegian and probably Scandinavian and maybe also Western context, you know, it's kind of the argument is kind of put upside down, because here it's the behavior of the boys in class that is a problem, while girls, it's said that education is more kind of suited for girls because it, you know, girls are more inclined to be willing to sit still and do their tasks and perform well. So it's kind of also made a gender problem where the problem is kind of placed within the gender themselves. I can see Elaine wanting to say something, please.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, possibly 2 or 3 points, just building on this thing about future research is such a good question. I think these long historical studies are of enormous importance because of the tendency of the research design to go for just a cross-sectional slice of data, or these randomized control tests, which suggest that you can just pick up some intervention about girls' education or training teachers in a particular way and drop it down anywhere in the world. And there's a very, very good book that's, I think, just been published by Fran Vavris, which actually reminds me of your work, Thera, because she's also reflecting on 30 years of her work in Tanzania on education and how, you know, there were times when education was extremely disorganized. It was disorganized by the AIDS epidemic, just like education in Tigray over the last 2 years has been completely disorganized by war. And so this notion that education is the universal panacea and that history doesn't throw us off course and confuse things. I think we need lots of historical studies of that kind so that we don't rinse out history and we don't rinse out the kind of power dynamics. You're baking them into the cake, and I think that's really, really important. And we need lots of studies of that nature to understand the complexity. Complexity isn't just a sentence saying tick the complexity box. It's a very, very profound kind of intellectual understanding. I think the other point that your discussion of girls and boys education in Norway and Scandinavian countries as opposed to Tanzania or Tigray brings out, it really is the importance of intersectionality, because it's not just any boys who are not doing well in Scandinavia, I think, or in the UK. It's boys from lower socioeconomic groups living in horrible economic conditions with really bad prospects of getting jobs. And it's really important to think about intersectionality in relation to those discussions about gender and really work that concept. I think we need lots more studies like that. And then the third, I guess, is the issue of the comparative dynamic, which I think was coming out very so interestingly in relation to what Vibeke was saying about what does and doesn't happen in Tanzania. We need to know why. We need to know why we see the same thing For example, teachers teaching in top-down or critical thinking, not realizing its potential for social transformation. We need a lot more comparative studies to enable us to answer some of these questions and again, appreciate and be open to very different sources of information and both inside schooling and outside. So, you know, I think what's so significant about your book is that you show us that we can do this kind of scholarship. I mean, you haven't told us about, well, I know there's a little bit in the introduction about your long time in the field and so on. But we know that doing this kind of scholarship is hard work. It's, and yeah, maybe my question to you is, do you want to give us a bit more of the flavor of living with the scholarship, and living with the production of the book, the lovely use of language, all of that, because it's a very lived text. It's you know, you're very present in it in a great way, and I think that's also inspiring to other scholars, that it's not distant, it's close, and it's close to things that you can enjoy doing, as well as obviously producing a book is hard work.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you, Elaine. It's actually already 4 o'clock, 4:02. So I think that we may, oh, there is one question, please. Can you speak up a little bit so that also those who are online can hear?
Introducing different education systems after 10th grade, but most of the problem comes when they are in 10th grade. A lot of parents get really motivated because, oh yeah, they are going to get anyways. Why send them, especially when they are girls? Why send them to school? And most of the people who get 10th grade are girls because it's not, the education is not priority. They obviously need to have to carry out that. So how do you think that can change? And also, like, change the mindset of the people, because like especially in the rural area, they're just thinking, okay, academic only works and not other opportunities. Like if you get education and become other than a doctor or something, you are not even viewed as educated. And I think that has set like a huge contribution to gender equality, because not a lot of people are academic.
Yes, a brief answer from Thera to
well, actually,
a huge question.
Well, actually, there is a new roadmap that came in educational roadmap that came in Ethiopia in 2018, which actually drops the 10th grade exam. So that means that you have an exam in 6th grade, then in 8th grade, and then no other exam before 12th grade. So they kind of have introduced a system where they actually jump this 10th grade where so many, both girls and boys, but more girls actually fail. It's true. Also, yeah, you're right about, I mean, the status from education. I mean, that is also, I think, when they see so many other girls and maybe also boys failing or falling out, dropping out of school, also the parents might be demotivated to continue the education, because they see that they might not get the job anyway. And then they just send them back to marriage. So it's kind of, yeah, it's a huge fallout of that. I think also in terms of jobs, I mean, if you actually have such a strategy for education, you should also have a strategy for getting youth into work. And here, as I see it in Ethiopia, you have a strategy for education, but then it's up to you to get that job afterwards. I think you have to kind of also have some strategy for the work of young people as well. The unemployment for young people is really high.
Yes, a very good point.
Mm.
Yes, I think that we will now close this session. I would like to thank a lot all the panelists and of course also Thera and Grip for organizing the event. And I can see there's one question left, which we are not going to let you answer, because then I think we will go on for half an hour more, but we can keep it as a research question for future research. How would you recommend masculinity to be investigated in terms of power structures, resistance to change? So that is a topic which young people here in the room, outside, out there in space can pick up on in relation to education. Thank you so much, everyone also who joined digitally, to the audience here at Bergen Global. And I wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.